Nishita, you're on mute. If you could please unmute yourself. Sorry to cut you out.
Thank you. A very good morning, good evening to all the lovely people joining us from around the world and our distinguished guests in the room. I am Nishtha Devani, and it's an absolute pleasure to welcome each and every one of you to WITCO Season 3 Grand Finale. WITCO stands for Women in the Corner Office, and it's a movement that seeks to break down barriers, shatter stereotypes, and create spaces where every individual feels heard, respected, and empowered. By popular demand, this is the first time ever that WITCO has opened its doors for everybody outside IBM as well, with a focus on spreading happiness. And I hope you're as excited as I am to unlock the happiness code. You know, happiness spreads by sharing. So if you've not already shared the link for this session with your near and dear ones, you can still do so and get them to join in too. And now, without spending any more time on this, I would like to introduce the man on a mission, the one who's helped build this movement into a global force, uniting 37,000 plus attendees from across the world. The global delivery leader, BPO IBM Consulting, and the founding curator of WITCO, Sachin Verma. Sachin, over to you.
All right, thank you everyone for being here. And I'm just going to start the day by saying, actually a big thank you. Thank you to everyone who's made the time to tune in online. Thank you to all of you. And actually, I also want to thank my family. I've been on the trot for probably traveling 6 weeks in a row. And I could be at a lot of other places. I could be with them. But this is a personal passion. And a big shout out goes to all of them. And also to all your families for giving you the time and space to be here. There's curating an event and curating a chapter on Women in the Corner Office. It takes about, every previous chapter has taken about 100+ hour investment on a individual. And the team is almost a dozen and a half that brings it together. So a big shout out. Without the Women in the Corner Office team, it would not have been. But there's a little bit of a story about getting to this place and getting to this point. And, you know, we take tremendous pride at our company, at our organization, about diversity. Diversity expressed in many different ways, including when it comes to gender. So the story about Women in the Corner Office, you know, over a 10-year period, if I remember, it was 2010. And in 2010, our gender diversity numbers were in the early 30s. It was still considered quite good back in the day. Today, we're at about 48%. And, you know, is it parity? Is it, I mean, it's a journey. There's always efforts you can make towards it. But the story is that it could have been another one of those initiatives, and we best sort of describe that as, it's a fireside chat that could never be, because that was the genesis. And so if you're wondering what happened that propelled this into something bigger, and I do see in the audience several of you who've been a part of this journey and made this powerful, this is what happened. So in February of 2021, you have to remember, this is, we had all, as the world, had survived a year of pandemic. We were all adjusting to what we thought was the new normal. I don't think it was the new normal. There is only one normal, which we're all thankfully back to. But you see this is, if you're looking at that data, this is released by Institute of Business Value, which is an IBM research division that presents this. This is 2019 data of women across different levels of an organization. So what happened in 2021? This is what happened in 2021. Across the board, across the globe, across organizations, and across levels, we actually saw a drop that took place. Now, if you're trying to calculate numbers, it's about, anything between 4 to 7, 8% was the extent of decline. And we said, look, we can't be feeling comfortable in our skin and saying we've made tremendous strides on diversity. So we said, look, we've got to take a step back and say, what else can we do to make this real? What was once a focus group became the Women in the Corner office core team. So what started up as a focus group, the focus group revealed a couple of interesting insights. They said, look, it is wonderful to speak to and hear from successful leaders, executives, internal, external, all of those things are absolutely relevant. But what happens is you get inspired. At the same time, they seem super heroic, but you find a gap. And the gap is, okay, how do I get to this level of attainment? Whatever that level of attainment is, that doesn't matter. And so the key thing, the key provocation or void that we all felt sensitized to was, I think as one of our members described it, as the reality deficit. And that reality deficit was, how do you get to have real world examples? Not like, hey, I had a tough moment, but I muscled up and I plumbed through and this is where I am and this is how I address challenges. And so getting to that point, it was, look, we aren't experts or specialists. So this is what I call a labor of love and a labor of heart. And, now that we are 7 chapters old, it's, somebody was asking me, actually Nisha was asking me yesterday, she was like, what happens in the process? And I said, by the time you get to real sharing, I actually said, it takes 2.5 sessions for somebody to open up. Because the first time you speak, you get, the muscle up, super heroic answers. And then the personal sharing comes with a little bit of thawing, saying, okay, I'm willing to share what exactly happened. So this was the big provocation. This is what took place. These are 2023 numbers on the new report. You can see there's some areas where we've made headway. But as an industry, as a world, we still have a lot of distance to cover. For those of you who want more details, just go to ibm.com, go to IBV, and you can find all these reports. They're available for the world at large. So I want to talk a little bit about the different chapters. And so the same focus group and a few more actually thought about what would that construct look like. And that construct started with, the first thing that came to our mind was actually about dismantling the glass ceiling. Because every one of us, actually almost gender agnostic, but this is focused on women, there will be a time, whether it is you've got a caregiving need, you happen to find a partner, get married, you may have moved to a different country, you may have just become a manager, you had a kid, it could be in numerous things. But there was that moment of time which, if it didn't stop you, it actually may have caused you to take a little bit of a pause and think, saying, how do I go forward with my professional aspirations versus balancing the requirements as they may be? And so we pretty much nosedived into those. Each of these chapters actually had a follow-up, which meant you had access to the panelists for mentoring sessions, because you can keep that conversation to what challenges you might have been experiencing. And then, of course, came the next part. Now that you have access to breaking the glass ceiling, what precisely will you need? You are going to have adversities. You are going to need a set of allies. And I also see Usha, who's sitting in the audience, who was a part of that second chapter. And the insights that we got from a lot of the panelists, I happened to be telling this at one of my alumni meets, and we were stuck in a traffic jam. That conversation took place. And the person who I ended up speaking with, this old schoolmate. She actually said, this is stuff that you can never find in a book, because these are just real life experiences which end up being that. And then we've sort of never looked back. We spoke about building your personal brand, accelerating careers, looking at how do you break the bias. We all have codes, which happen to be the case. And we've tried to be topical. And I think one of the most ambitious topics we had was around financial independence. The fact is, as recession, inflation, and all of those things started to set in, and you realize that no matter what organizations or whatever your business was paying you, you needed to have a second thing, how you're going to build some sustainability into your financial well-being. And there are methods and codes to be able to do that. And that it just yielded a lot of actionable things that individuals could do to be able to address this. Of course, equity and allyship remains, and I think we're at that point that at the end of the day, there is a universal and an underlying theme which comes to happiness. You think about it, all of our material ambitions, desires, etc., personal, professional, etc., I think there's an underlying theme that we all strive for, which is around happiness. So that was a little bit of a history on Women in the Corner office. The teams put together a little bit of a video which serves as a flashback. Okay, we're going to have to come back to the video. But now I do want to invite Amit Sharma, and Amit has been a huge sponsor. He's helped take this to the broader world. Amit heads all of consulting delivery, which is the GICs. Without further ado, Amit, over to you.
Thank you, Sachin. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Let me start just sharing, this morning I was rushing into the office and someone greeted me with a smile in the elevator. And I was just reflecting, hey, I'm happy to be in the office. And we've had a really rough week in terms of lots of meetings, external stuff going on, clients, and I was just glad to be back. But what really, I took a step back and said, oh, okay, I'm glad to be here, but the previous 3 hours were a little unusual. Usual in the sense that I got up early, did my workout, ready to leave to work, but the driver was delayed, so I needed to drive myself, which was fine. Daughter needed me at the school. Mother called saying there's a power outage in the house, something's burnt. So I came in 3 hours late. Okay? But I was still happy, and I was happy because it's Friday. Okay? And you reflect back and say, why is it that everyone's happy on Friday? And at least for me, it's about having, it's the time of the week, it's really when you make social connections. We're all social animals, and I think you rekindle that flame by, once you get to Friday. So I'm going to reflect a little bit on this happiness, and there's no better time to do it on a Friday. It's Friday evening here. I know it's Friday morning in other parts of the world, but I think we're closer to happiness here. Right? And I know Sachin is, of course. So let me just reflect on, how, when it comes to what we think about happiness and how we make this real, right? It's not something that you can make up. I mean, everyone has anxiety, everybody has stress. I have a unique vantage point in, looking at or, leading a team of over 100,000 consulting professionals in over 40 countries. And from my vantage point, when I look at patterns, I'll just call out 2 or 3 things. Engaged teams have higher productivity. And it doesn't matter how you measure productivity, by utilization or how many lines of code or customer satisfaction or what have you. There's clearly a direct correlation in that. You won't believe there's a correlation between sick leave and engagement. Teams with higher engagement and happiness take fewer days off for sick leave. So your wellness plays into this equation. And diverse teams perform significantly better, as much by a third in terms of the output than teams that are not diverse. And you can go and look at external reports and statistics, and the numbers will be varying, maybe 25%, 30%, you name it. But the point is, diversity is a business imperative because it yields productivity and because it's the right thing to do. Now, along with diversity, the challenge we all face around the world, not just here in India, but all over the world, is the leaky pipeline. You look at what happens, typically workforces, particularly in the technology world, start off half and half, and then as you go along over time, depending on which level you look at, you lose somewhere, a significant chunk, depending between 20 and 50%, for a variety of societal reasons and business reasons. And there are efforts to go address that. But the one I want to call out where all of us can really make a difference is allyship. Because allyship is something that everybody can do. More importantly, it's something that everyone must do. It doesn't matter what your gender is, your race is. You can be an ally in the smallest of things, and it makes a huge difference. You may not realize it, but it all compounds. So as a culture, I would really encourage that all of us take that personal pledge today to become allies. Okay? Now, when I take a step back and look at what's also happening as a different trend, there's one of the most obvious ones is what's happening with return to work. And looking at patterns and different countries are at different stages in terms of how they're adapting to it for obvious reasons. There are different economic conditions and different traffic situations, different parking situations, home care, so on, you name it. But what I see is, again, and this is early days, so it's not backed by enough data, but I would say some data, that team, at this point, just in terms of reference, about more than 3/4 of my team are on a hybrid pattern, which means 3 days a week or more. So what I see is that the teams that come into work and the teams that interact, serendipity and innovation seem to happen side by side, be it at the coffee, at the coffee machine, or chatting over lunch or what have you. Those sparks of creativity are coming back. But the flip side of that equation is there's also the times when people work remote that actually charged because they realize, okay, there's a payback. I didn't spend those 2 hours in a commute. Well, let me go get my work done and charge it out. At least I won't be tired by the end of the day. So I think this blend of hybrid is the way the world's going to be, at least for some time to come. And we're seeing the benefit of that in how we operate in the work patterns. But then when you overlay it with generative AI, I know it's a bit of a buzzword, but it's real. If you look at how it is changing some jobs, it is very profound. And I think it's going to get very mainstream very, very rapidly. And all of us in the workforce, I think, have a unique opportunity to embrace, reskill ourselves, and get onto this bandwagon, because as you have seen in the past when it comes to automation or automation tools or calculators or whatever other technology that's assisted human beings, the ones who adapt quickly really get a significant benefit out of it. And I think this is no different, except that here everybody's starting at ground zero. There is no one's already ahead. It's not that you came in with a disadvantage and you were in the horse carriage world, but there were already people who had the Model T. And here, everyone's at ground zero. So what's going to distinguish and make a difference is just your own ability to play with generative AI, leverage it in whatever you do, in whatever form you do, and make a success of it. So it's really about that. I think it's going to be the people who really embrace it are going to reap the economic rewards. They're going to reap the rewards of being able to do things that are really cool, which a lot of other people will not be able to do. I was even impressed to see that happiness has found its way into the AI world. There are so many apps that you can download to make yourself happy or aid and assist yourself in your well-being. So you can you realize that automation and generative AI, really, they're all blurring. The lines are blurring between them, and you're going to find that it'll find its way into everything we do. I'm really excited in terms of where I look at the future, and as we transform our workforce, I think we are onto a cusp. When we look back over our working times, we'll know we were there when this whole thing took off, and we are at a time where we can really make significant change to how we operate and the impact we draw. Thank you. Sachin, back to you.
So it's actually quite incredible. You know, when I met Amit in the morning from where he started, Amit was in a shirt, and I said, Amit, where's your jacket? And he says, don't even ask about it. And of course, he relayed the story. We all had a great laugh. I think that's the most we laughed during the day today. So Amit, thank you for sharing that. Now, look, there's this entire point around, around happiness. And so if you think about why happiness, I think there's just interesting amount of data, right? I think this is something that everyone is looking for. But I was just amazed to look at, I've run delivery. So you just have a natural gravitation to look for data around everything. And as part of that data element, there were some interesting facts that came up. One was, the happiness is actually, estimates are it's about a $4.2 trillion industry. We all consume happiness and happiness-related products, services, etc. to that effect. Any Insta folks who are there are like 177 million happiness posts on Instagram. 177 million posts. I believe on some estimate, there are almost 3.5 million people who've taken courses on happiness. Happiness finds its way to Cambridge, it finds its way to the US Constitution, and it finds its way everywhere, right? So those are just some interesting things that you need to all understand about happiness. Now, look, the main act is really Jen Lim, and we're going to bring her on stage. And this is really, my part as the architect and moderator. So I get asked the question. One of the things that the team has always got around to getting me to speak about is saying, leave us with a code, right? I mean, everyone's busy, so tell us 5 things that need to happen, and so on and so forth. And I got a lot of questions on my LinkedIn post, which was, everyone, I've had questions. I mean, as we asked about happiness, someone said it's freedom, someone said it's purpose, and someone said, it's buying my BMW car, and it meant so many different things. And I was actually reminded of something that happened during the pandemic. I think a lot of us would have lost our minds in the pandemic. And I came across something beautiful that actually made a huge difference. And it actually, I think it was Robin Sharma, and it's been written about by others. It starts with a very simple thing called gratitude. And so if you were to think, and then I found a lot of data that said, if there is one thing that you could probably do, which is guaranteed to make you happy, anything to the tune of 15 to 20%, it is this. Like so many people have written about it. I experienced it personally. So I can speak for myself. You can speak for if you end up doing it. So it goes something like this. If you make a list, you ideally you should do it every day. Make a list of things that made you happy or you're grateful for. It could be just about anything. It's a bit of a struggle doing it, by the way. It's not easy. But it could be as little as you got a hug from a family member. Yeah, your dog came in, was all over you. Whatever it might have been. A great cup of coffee. Any of those little things. And you start putting that list together. You know what happens? And by the way, they say you have to do this for about 66 days. And Howard actually tells their students, I mean, one of the professors at least tells the student to do this on a weekly basis. What that does, because you're repeatedly making associations with things that may have given you momentary joy or happiness, every time you experience this, it actually lifts you. It actually lifts you. Now, you compound that with starting with 20 minutes of doing any form of activity or exercise, you actually release a lot of the cortisols. And then you do something like that, it actually is one of the most beautiful things that has worked for me. Yeah, it may be worth something that you want to try. Okay, I see a question from the audience.
So Sachin, loved your post on LinkedIn. I loved the bit about the coffee and the saloon and things like that, right? And you just spoke about. Thank you. You spoke about all the highs that we get and all the things that we go after. Your goals, your targets. Do you want that car? Do you want a house? You get that, you get a high, right? And then after some time, even a week, you come crashing down. So how do you get rid of that trap, right? So that's a question that I have.
Okay, we are all driven by goal attainment reward. We're conditioned like that in school, at work, in sports. I mean, that is just how the human psychology works. So what does that really do? You get this big burst of dopamine. But when you've got it, you're like, okay, now what? And you're like, okay, I got to find my next thing. Yeah, you got a promotion, you're like, I got to go find my next gig. And I got to find my next project. And I got to find my next, whatever that next may be for you. For someone, it's money. For someone, it's whatever else. And that pretty much happens on repeat. I actually don't know how to break away from it. But here's something that I did learn. So if you thought about this, it's actually a sum of things that you desire, and at the bottom of it is things that you have, and at the bottom of it is things that you desire. Now you can say, I can keep adding more and more things. I can keep adding more and more things to it, and that's how I can continue to feel better. Well, there's another way, and that other way is you can actually trim the number of things that you want, all these obsessions that we may have with material objects, whatever else. So those are ways of handling that sort of dopamine or that satisfaction drop that you hit across. Now, I know we're running out of time, but I'll take your question.
Sachin, you spoke about Insta users and the amount of happiness posts that we see on Insta. What is the obsession that Gen Zs and millennials have with social media today?
Okay, I'm going to answer that question, but I'm going to answer that question with my closing that I have. It is a fact that teenagers and actually a lot of adults, etc., are just constantly glued to Facebook, Instagram. There are a lot many other things which I actually am not the best example or advertisement for it. But it is, there's a, what do you call this? It's almost there's a neuropeptide. It's called oxytocin. So what happens when you get on this, you actually get, you post something, you get likes, and you're like, okay, I feel good. Essentially, oxytocin is what you need. Oxytocin is what you need to be able to, which you will typically get from contact with a person, from establishing touch with a person. That's what happens. But because you're spending inordinate amount of time, which you're doing on social media, you get a little trippy with it. You need more and more and more of it because you're not really getting what you really want. And then I will come to my closing part. As a student, as a researcher on happiness, as an absolute student and researcher, I spent some time trying to find, is there anything that is telling you what, if there was the one thing, if there was really the one thing that you could do, what would that be? And I found something very interesting. Actually, it's an 82-year-old research that was done by Howard. It is actually a study on adult development. And some interesting findings. By the way, if in a survey millennials were asked that 80% of them, what they were looking for in terms of happiness was money, 50% of them were looking for 50% of them were looking for being famous. But what does that study reveal? So they looked at 700 and some 24 subjects. They analyzed everyone for patterns. And there were two groups that they had formed. One, of course, were sophomores from a Harvard batch. Majority of them went to war. And then the second one was kids that came from, let's just say, an underprivileged neighborhood. And that study over this 82-year period and 724 subjects, if you looked at any patterns that were there, and they would subject them to questionnaires, medical reports, speaking to families, households, etc. But they only found one common thing, which actually is the prediction of, happiness. And if you were going to have a satisfied, adult, healthy, and happy life. And that was nothing but having great relationships, the quality of your social relationships. And I just thought that was amongst the most profound things. There's no other pattern. Somebody was a bricklayer, somebody became an exec, somebody became something else, but that's what it was. So with that, I'm going to call it a wrap and introduce you to Jen Lim, who is one of the world's renowned speakers. She's a best-selling author and absolutely one of the authorities who does this for a living and is super passionate about it. So without any further ado, let me introduce you to Jen Lim. Jen, over to you, and thank you for being with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. Is everyone seeing me in the slides okay? I take that as a yes. I haven't heard anything. So thank you so much for having, okay, thank you, Anne. I have been absorbing everything that's been said so far. So based on the logic, it's 5:30 a.m. for me here in the Bay Area in San Francisco. So I'm not quite as happy as you are yet because you're in the evening, but I'll get there soon. Thank you so much for the preface. It sounds like a lot of, there's a lot of depth in how you're already thinking about happiness. And so it makes me even more excited to be here. And one of the reasons why I was really, amped up for this particular conversation is because how your team that put this together is so committed to really wanting to make this meaningful to you. The level of their genuine desire to have an impact on everyone that's listening and watching and tuning in wherever you are in the world, I was really floored by how much they really wanted this to make some sort of impact. And when they talked about the happiness code, and I'm here talking about beyond happiness, and I always get jokes because oh, you're talking about beyond happiness, I'm still trying to figure happiness out. And so what I'd like to do is to stretch your perception of what happiness may be. Because sometimes, as Sachin already talked about, it's making more money, it's buying a car, it's having a good cup of coffee, it's being with friends, it's being okay with being yourself. So in terms of authenticity. So we have this huge gamut of what happiness can mean. So we have this very subjective term, yet very universal, because you go anywhere in the world, you say happiness, and someone has their own interpretation of it. So for me, and I've been in, doing this in the happiness industry for a couple decades now, which is crazy. It's been so cool to see that there's been a lot of data and research, scientific happiness, positive psychology, more and more substance to how we can define happiness. And the biggest thing, I think, and if you're talking about code, I can tell you X, Y, and Z of what happiness is scientifically, through positive psychology, etc. But at the end of the day, the happiness code is yours. to define. And what I'd like to share is that, there are measured ways that we know what increases your happiness levels, but unless you do the work to understand what happiness actually truly means to you, then a code doesn't mean anything. It really means, at the end of the day, this is probably the easiest and hardest, but most worthwhile work you can do to try and define it for yourself. So with that, I love starting these conversations with a reflection question, because if we want to be present to where we are today, number one is to reflect on how we got here. So, question for you, reflection. Where were you in 2020 BC? And of course, I don't mean that in biblical terms, I mean before COVID. So just take a moment to think about, what were you thinking, what were you feeling, what kind of goals or aspirations did you have? And let's all go back, because what's been so interesting now that we have had time to reflect, first time that the world got 2020'd at one time. And just thinking about all the things that happened, what's really interesting is that futurists actually predicted all these things. There was a pandemic, there was a recession, social inequality, disruptive technology, all these things. We knew they were coming. We just did not know it was going to happen in 1 year, all in 1 year. So the world got 2020. We shut down a little bit, and for a lot of people, a long time. And what we realized is that even though the pace of change, the rate and complexity of change was already surpassing before 2020, our physiological, everyday ability to process it, things just got exacerbated once 2020 hit. So just to give a quick example, the pace of change of what we've seen in the last decades, the good old telephone took 75 years to reach 50 million people. If you were to guess what took 19 days to reach 50 million people, you could throw out your answers. I'm actually not able to see the chat, and I don't want to mess up with the PowerPoint slide right now. So, yeah. So anyway, if you were to guess, what would it be? People say COVID is like Zoom or whatever, and actually it was Pokemon Go. And then just fast forward several months ago, we saw yet another rapid pace of change, and it took 60 days to reach double 100 million people. If you were to guess what it is, you could probably already guess it's ChatGPT. So this is all just showing us as examples, like things are happening, things are changing fast. And we had to make hard choices in the last few years that we never had to make as human beings. As an example, we had to decide if we were going to wake up 5 minutes earlier to get on video, or if we were just going to pop out of bed and go audio only. And for some people, think it's 5 o'clock somewhere. So I remember before COVID, BC, I remember the clock was ticking down. 2020 was about to hit, and I was just feeling, so joyous of like, wow, the future is here and we're about to live it. Then, of course, COVID happened, and got a few more wrinkles, got a few more gray hairs. But I think if we were to actually reflect, the hope is that we actually gained some more wisdom too. And so thinking about where we are now versus then, it's not even about work-life balance anymore. It's not even about work-life integration. It's this sense of like we experience what work-life coexistence means. And people were making really hard choices. And we've heard all about the Great Resignation, Great Reset, Great Reshuffle, quiet quitting, quiet promoting, quick quitting. I mean, all the list goes on and on of like the next TikTok sensation of what people were going through and that we're still enduring right now. So what's been interesting since this all happened is that there's been more stats to understand what it is that people are feeling and why they are disengaged or why they're quitting. McKinsey stated this, it's pretty simple. I don't feel cared for by my managers. I don't feel cared for by my organization. I don't feel like I belong. But on the brighter side of things, so now we actually have a better sense of what's causing all this sense of disengagement or burnout and all the things that we're having to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So what's interesting that BC and AC is that MIT has been able to show us this is the first time that it's toxic corporate culture over comp, over benefits, over all the other things that used to cause turnover or burnout before is actually not being in a culture that feels like you belong, that feels like you're engaged. But on the positive side, we now know since COVID that if you do have a strong connection to your culture, you'll be up to 75 times more likely to be fully engaged in not just your work, but actually your own personal life. So as I was zooming out and reflecting a little bit, we've had this great resignation, but on the other side of the spectrum, we also have people that came to a great reawakening or awakening, in the sense that once 2020 hit, people were like, why am I spending the time and precious minutes of the day doing this? Am I prioritizing the things that really matter most to me? So silver lining part is like, at least there have been people and there have been time that this time to take advantage of being reflective of what really means the most. Because realistically, there's no way you can wake up in the morning and go to sleep, have that time span, and be completely happy the whole time. It's just not feasible. It's not realistic at all. But what we now know more than ever is that you can wake up in the morning and go to sleep and have this sense of fulfillment, have a sense that you're living a meaningful life. So this is where I'm trying to go beyond happiness in the sense of like, what does that actually mean to be fulfilled, to be having a sense of purpose and meaning, knowing there's so many things that are going on still in our lives. So what I'd love for everyone to think about as I carry on in this presentation is, what's the world that you want to live in? And why I ask that is because things are sometimes very chaotic. We're also busy. We don't have any time. But maybe one way to simplify things, and this goes back to your own personal definition of what true sustainable happiness is to start defining the world that you want to live in, not anyone else, therefore, and be able to figure out what happiness and your habits and therefore behaviors will be. So just prefacing when I say happiness, again, I talk about scientific happiness and positive psychology. So what the data has shown, and even back to the days of Aristotle and Socrates, they've been talking about what happiness is. Fast forward to today, when I say happiness, these are the core things as to what sustainable happiness means. Number one, living truly authentic to yourself, to the core of your being. Number two is not being tethered by technology because you're tethering it, knowing what technology does for you and your life. Having a compass, having a North Star, that's part of happiness. Having a higher purpose, super sustainable, but also making sure your clock, the time you spend in your days, is aligned with that compass, with that North Star in a prioritized way. Another form of happiness is having grit, or a new word I love is dauntless, being dauntless in your everydays. And having grit and resilience doesn't mean reading another self-help book or reading an inspirational quote and going on your day. Having grit and resilience is meaning that you personally know that you can get through this again. You can get through this next low to get to another high. And last but not least, it's sustainable happiness comes from having your most meaningful relationships close to you. And pro tip on any slide, I would highly suggest, if you ever have a chance to put an image of a pet and a toddler in any of our presentations, highly recommend it. It's good for the soul. So fast forward now, where are you today in 2023 AC? So fast forward to the beginning of this year, I think all of us had a greater sense of hope. We've been through a lot. At the same time, we were kind of trepidatious as to what was behind that door. And lo and behold, we've still had a lot of uncertainties in our own life, whether it's socioeconomic, whether it's still global changes, and the war in Ukraine, etc. I can name a lot of things, but I think you know what I mean. This is causing still a highly volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous state. But what's more important, that these are external factors we cannot control. What's important is that it's causing us as a global society a sense of some sort of fear, some sort of uncertainty, some sort of doubt. And that's what brings us to what happiness could mean to you. Because I'm going to talk about silver lining about all this. What was really great about this tumultuous time since 2020 is that we finally blew the cover as to what was already under the hood. We already had a high turnover rate. We already had disengagement. There was a lot of stress. Burnout was already there, and mental health was already there. But now we can actually talk about these things in more transparent and sincere and honest ways. And that in that way, that was a silver lining, because if we can acknowledge that these things were happening and we can actually have a discussion about it, then all these stats about why burnout is still the number one thing that's plaguing us as a global workforce, high stress, anxiety, all the things that we feel from time to time, now we can actually address it. And one of the takeaways is that we as a society have not yet really acknowledged, taken the time, or even addressed what this is, how this has been impacting us mentally and physically. So thinking about all that, here we are, rate of change is exponential, and we have our physiological rate of adaptation as human beings. So it gets a little scary, because like this rate of change is outpacing us, but now we know more than ever. And this is just compared to just generations of my parents, my grandparents. And I'll like give an example in my personal upbringing. They were concerned about getting food on the table on a day-to-day basis, and those basic physiological needs that we have a bit of a luxury, a little bit more of a gap in not having to worry and stress about that on a day-to-day basis. So just thinking about the change that happened just in the last 1 or 2 decades, what we now know is, and what we have basically the luxury of, is that all our ancestors prior to us succeeded in giving us a sense of freedom, in giving us a sense of spaciousness to actually realize, even with all this change, if we can have us tethered as individuals psychosomatically in our heads, in our hearts, in our well-being, and we can tether and ground ourselves, then the rate of change doesn't matter as much anymore, because we are grounded in ourselves. So when I think about when I started working, I was a KPMG consultant. I remember when people would talk about love and care as four-letter words that we can never talk about in the workplace. But now, more than ever, we can actually discuss it in a way that leaders, and when I say leader, I just want to say it's not about being a CEO or director or whatever title. It's a leader of your own life, leader of your work life, and the decisions, knowing the decisions you make is coming from your own. So now we have in workplace environments, and even globally, in a way that leaders are more respected if they can think and do and say from the head and the heart. So I'm just going to share a little bit of my backstory, 2020 BC. You may or may not have heard this company called Zappos back in the day. And so Tony Hsieh, the late CEO, and I started working on a book called Delivering Happiness. And we launched it around 2010. Zappos, if you haven't heard about it, they were acquired by Amazon back in 2008 for about $1.2 billion. Fast forward, we launched this book. We just thought we were going to check it off of the things to do in life. But lo and behold, there was a demand for happiness. So Tony and I decided to create a company around it. And it was really a simple premise, helping other organizations, so companies like yours, hospital systems, governments, really think about how it can systematize what it means when you have happier employees or people. You'll have happier customers, and you'll have a more profitable and sustainable business. But more importantly, what we're also doing in that is to create more meaningful lives, purposeful lives as well. So that launched, and we were like, oh, it was pretty amazing. It went global. And we ended up on the Inc. 5000 fastest growing company list. And so things were pretty, yeah, amazing in a way. It was a dream I never knew I had. But then, of course, 2020 hit, and the inconceivable happened. I don't know if y'all remember this movie, but I bet a lot of people might remember every single line in this movie too. But inconceivable things happen, and not just to me, it happened to everyone in this world. And so 2020, I started writing this book called Beyond Happiness. And I had this like really nice and tidy outline, and I was like ready to like just hammer it all out. But of course, every other week, we saw a new headline that really changed the way we were looking at life and the way we had to operate in it. So as I was going through all these, observing all these changes in the world, I realized like, hey, you know, everyone is actually experiencing some form of loss and trauma right now. And when I say loss and trauma, I don't use those words lightly. It's not just necessarily like loss of a human being to COVID. It's loss of hope, a loss of a job, a loss of a friendship that you thought you always had. So this was happening around the world, and it just made me remark on what is going on. And as I was doing my research for the book, I came across this quote because everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. And this quote says, "Be kind." But what I really want to stretch here is like, why don't we just be human? Knowing that the person that you work with in Zoomland or around, across the table, or the stranger on the street, we can acknowledge that everyone's fighting a battle we don't know about. So, with that observation, the question now is how have we processed these changes in our lives? And what do we think? What do we feel? What do we do about these things now? So 2020 BC, we have this exercise we've been doing with all our clients, and it's called Happiness Heartbeats. And it really is about not just your highs, because when we talk about happiness, people think automatically, yeah, you know, rainbows and unicorns, good cup of coffee, getting a new car. But really, the heartbeats is about the highs and the lows, so that you know that the gamut of your highs don't get as hot unless you actually understand those lows as well. And the real problem is actually when when you flatline, because that's much less desirable than having the highs and lows. So thinking about this exercise, what was really impactful was when people wanted to understand and revisit. So just thinking about your own happiness and your definition, revisiting now what happiness means to you and what your values mean to you, basically how you live your life, is so important. And I'll give you an example. So this is an exercise I'll run through with you. And at the end of the presentation, I just want to share that we'll have a QR code so you can download all these exercises for yourself, your team, etc. But just to give you an example of my happiness heartbeats and where this led to me today, because I just redid this exercise during since COVID. So my high, I'm Asian American. My parents from Hong Kong. I had a high because I grew up in a household that there were three quintessential things to be successful in life. Number one, get into good school. Number two, become a doctor or lawyer. Number three, learn a variety of musical instruments. So for me, I thought I had it made. I got into UC Berkeley. I was studying pre-med, and I had years of piano under my belt. But as I started studying, I realized, you know what? This doesn't feel like me. So I started wandering, and I came across something called Asian American Studies. And I just got so impassioned by this topic. I learned so many things about myself, my ancestors, and I decided to major in it. And so I picked up the phone, called up my parents. You can probably predict the next scene. They completely freaked out and said, Asian American Studies, why don't you just come home more often and we'll tell you what your Asian American Studies is all about? But I decided to do it anyway. And in reflection and doing this exercise, like in the last few years, I realized that was the first time I didn't do what was expected of me, but I did something that was respecting myself. So anyway, that happened, and I got sped out into the dot-com boom. If y'all remember, money title status was literally in my lap, a lot of people's laps here in the Silicon Valley, literally overnight. But the dot-com busted, and I lost it all. I got laid off, and the money title status was gone. So I felt like a total loser, and this is like when my lows started happening. And I thought it couldn't get any lower, but just within the same year, my dad got diagnosed with stage 3 colon cancer, and we lost him just a few years after. So I realized at that point I was not living by what meant everything to me, which was obviously not the money title status. So what did mean something to me? And so I started trying to be more purposeful, trying to be more intentional, prioritizing people, prioritizing not money, not a job, prioritizing things that actually would never make me look back with regret. And fast forward, that's when Delivering Happiness was born, another high in my life. Again, a dream I never knew I had. Fast forward again, we had to reorg the company, and being a people-driven company was really hard. I was like public enemy number one to my team, but we survived and we were able to adapt, and then we became fastest growing company in Inc. So I'm just exemplifying what I went through in my highs and lows. And when I'm reflecting on this, and I'll go through the exercise with you in a second, I got to see and ask myself, like, what values were there or not there in both the highs and the lows? What people were there or not there? And by digging deeper and reflecting on this, I realized my values were very clear. It's authenticity of myself. It's having meaningful relationships and prioritizing them. And it's a sense of freedom, a freedom of being who I am and making those choices based on that. So I'll walk through this with you in a bit, but I just want you to, like, as a reminder, think about what this might mean to you. Fast forward 2020, finishing up the book, I was trying to at least, and then another low hit. And that's when I lost my co-founder and one of my best buds in life, Tony Shea. So this really threw me off. And to be super transparent, I never knew what depression was until this happened. And I'm sharing this because I know everyone in this world went through their own highs and lows, especially in 2020. So I had about 5 weeks to, when he passed away, I had 5 weeks to turn in the manuscript. Luckily, I had a forgiving publisher. She gave me an extra day. I'm just kidding. She gave me a few more weeks. But the point being, I started questioning everything I had learned, everything I'd done, everything our team had done around the world about what real sustainable happiness is. And so the irony of it all, as I was processing his death, I was processing everything that we went through in that year. The irony of it all was that I realized these highs and lows were more important than ever. It's about loss, it's about life. And we realize that we eventually lose the people and things we love, including ourselves. And with that impermanence, what we can do, though, with these heartbeats is that we can ground ourselves in ourselves. That grounding of psychosomatic well-being, even though things are changing around us. So as I continued researching and try to, finish this book, I came across this quote by Norman Cousins: "Death is not the greatest loss in life. The greatest loss is what dies inside while we're still alive." And then I kept on reading and started looking around the different kind of textbooks and material out there. I realized Tupac and Buddha pretty much said the same thing in so many words in their own way. And at that point, I got really excited because I was like, I cannot wait to be able to put a PowerPoint slide together with Norman Cousins, Tupac, and Buddha all on the same slide. In the notion that there's this universality of this, not just definition of life, but what death can mean. And so here we are now, and thinking about what are these highs and lows about, and the difference in being able to reflect about it and being able to ask a very simple question: what did you learn from these highs and lows in your own life? And that's the difference between whether we have post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic growth. Because the reality is, like, we can't erase the traumas in our life, but we can reduce the impact it has on us if we can process things in a way that's growth versus stress. So I will just kind of walk through for your own sort of sense of, like, experiencing what this might mean for you. What are your own personal beyond happiness heartbeats? Again, this exercise will be available later, but just think about your own highs, your own lows. Just maybe think about one at this time, one high, one low in the last few years, in your whole life. And think about the values that may be associated with them. As an example, here are the most common values, and I talked about mine: authenticity, freedom, and relationships. But, like, when you think about your highs and lows, what values were there or not there? And when you go through this exercise of different moments that were the most meaningful in that stretch of highs and lows, what's interesting is because then you have a better sense of what true values you want to live by. And you'd be surprised how many people actually thought they were living by them, but don't actually have the compass and the clock aligned to what their values are. I thought I was going to be able to see the chat, and I'm not able to see it, but if you want to contribute to the chat, think about your value that was present or absent in that high and low, and have a reflection moment of how might you better live those values. going forward, knowing that how you live your life is basically aligned with how you want to define what sustainable happiness means to you. So fast forward, after I had to finish the book, I landed on this concept of what it means to go beyond, having been in the space for so long. And what I realized is that it's about living fully, fully in our highs and our lows. And what I mean by that is that if we can embrace not just our strengths, but our shadows, our bright and our blind spots, and our resilience along with fears, that's when we're actually being our whole selves. And that's when we can find some psychological safety in being authentic. And when I say psychological safety, it's been a term that's used quite a bit since COVID. And psychological safety is so important, not just for ourselves internally, but also with teams. Google had a really great survey or study called the Aristotle Project. And so essentially, they wanted to understand and answer one question very simply. How do you make the most effective teams in an organization? And it was about 30,000 employees, longitudinal over, I think, 3 years. And what they realized, it wasn't, the best manager, it wasn't having the best software, it was actually having psychological safety. Those were the most effective teams, so that people could say, hey, look, we did this amazingly well, let's celebrate that. And they could also say, we kind of messed up there. What can we learn and how can we move forward? So with that, I came to this other sort of evolution of what has been going on in happiness and going beyond. And it was about, people sometimes can say, oh, I can't think about happiness at work, that's not an association for me. But what people cannot deny, and this is something that we lost along the way, especially after COVID, is a sense of growth. So the greenhouse metaphor came to me. It's something that Tony and I used to talk about as leaders. As leaders, we want to grow greenhouses. We basically want people to grow, create the conditions for them. We don't have to be the tallest plant. We don't have to be the biggest tree. It's not about that. It's about creating conditions for people to grow. And so that makes total sense. But we were missing a very big component in that. It's that, yes, we want to nurture others, but we also need to nurture our greenhouse too. Nurture our own greenhouse so we can grow them better for others. And we forgot over time. It's kind of like the, oxygen mask in an airplane metaphor, but, we didn't fly for 3 years or something, so we forgot what that meant. But now's the time to remind ourselves, how do we actually nurture our greenhouse, tend to it as we grow others? So when I talk about this concept, a lot of people say, yeah, but I'm too busy for that. Who has time to nurture a greenhouse? We all have jobs that seem like they're unachievable because the tasks keep on growing and growing and we can never get things done. But what's really been interesting though is like we're so programmed. Like when we see this on our phone, we know automatically what to do with it. Yet we don't know how and what to do with ourselves when a battery is low for our own sense of wholeness and our own sense of well-being. So this might all sound great. Like, of course, we all want to recharge our batteries, but how insert your own expletive here. How do we do that? So my synthesis of what's been going on is what I've been calling the greenhouse model. And this is kind of getting to the brass tacks of how we do it. What on the left side, who on the right side, and together is the how. So I'm just going to break it down. On the bottom of the what side is values and behaviors. So essentially, what are your own personal values? And what are your behaviors that you're acting by them? So one of the biggest things that we've learned is that if we want ourselves, our teams, our organizations to live by these, we need to make sure that we're recognizing and rewarding it and acknowledging when we are living, not just by our values, but also our specific behaviors that align with those values as well. Because what we've seen in the past, there's so many examples of when that's not in place, when values and behaviors are not aligned. I don't know if you remember that back in the day, there's a story about Enron, and ironically enough, their number one value was integrity. So clearly a disconnect with what integrity is on a behavioral level. But then fast forward to where we were just a few years ago, WeWork, Theranos, and what is so fascinating about these companies is that they were so purpose driven. Their leaders were like, we're going to change the world. And yet now we know there was a huge misalignment between how they were wanting to change the world, what they were saying from their purpose, and how they were actually acting behaviorally with their values. But on the flip side, what happens when they are in place? What happens when values are aligned with how people behave? You get a sense of autonomy, freedom. People are trusted for what they do and what they think. There's a sense of alignment. There's accountability in the sense of I got your back, you got mine. We're doing this together. And you develop more meaningful relationships. So as an example, I'm really inspired by nature. So dolphins, when they're out swimming in pods, in other words, they're on teams, each dolphin has a very specific role. So some dolphins like swim around the perimeter to make sure all the fish stay within. Some dolphins go on the bottom, kind of kick the fish up, and then one by one they all feed in turn. And at the end of the day, they're all getting their job done and they're getting fed and they're all doing it because they have a higher alignment, a purpose, and they all know very specifically what their role in each of this in this greater goal. So that's the values and behaviors, going to higher purpose. We hear about this a lot. It's simply, what is it that you're doing that's greater than yourself? What are you a part of that's greater than yourself? So we know a lot of organizations out there have a higher purpose, but the biggest key here is to define your own personal purpose so that you can align that with the higher purpose of your team, the higher purpose of your company. And when I say define your own purpose, it means not just your work purpose. It means your life purpose as well. Because that's when you can see, this coexistence of work and life is that much more relevant today than BC. And what we've seen, great place to work in the last couple of years, purposeful workplaces when people are aligned, 3 times the retention, and also people are recommending their job and their workplace to their friends. So what happens when purpose is in place at work? I always love talking about this example, and that's Airbnb. This one is like how they actually navigated through the pandemic and to where they are today. Sometimes when you see advertisements from Airbnb, you have no idea what they do, but we all know what they do from a hospitality and housing standpoint. Their biggest thing is their purpose is we all belong, and that's what they stand by. And from the days of them having to do layoffs, when the CEO wrote a very heartfelt letter expressing why they had to do layoffs and what was going to happen from there, fast forward to today, they're actually, I think they had one of the most successful years and profitable years based on their changes and adaptations during COVID. So going from values, behaviors, higher purpose, and then to greenhouse conditions is what is the sandwich in the middle. So the greenhouse conditions, and I lay this out in like the nuts and bolts in the book, but what I like to describe and how to kind of glue this all together is a metaphor that I love because I'm here. I don't know if y'all have been to California, but we have the sequoias here, so huge trees. And what I love about this example or metaphor is that so these are like the tallest trees in the world, and yet they have the shortest root structure. It's fascinating. Like, how is it the tallest trees in the world, shortest root structure? And they actually did this experiment where scientists put some colored dye on one end of the forest, and years later, they found the same colored dye at the other end of the forest. I hope that dye was organic, otherwise, that would be pretty messed up to the trees. But all this to say is because there's this greater sense of alignment, of connection. This is one tree. If it's missing some sap or missing some water, the other trees group around and actually create and provide the sustenance for that tree. So by having this connections, and earlier we were talking about social connectivity, it's because they have the sense of belonging, they have this sense of alignment with their values and their higher purpose to not just survive but thrive, no matter what kind of conditions they're in. These are the kind of things that we can think about and how we actually build more meaningful sense of conditions that we can focus on to be able to grow as individuals and as a team. So, go on the back one. That's the what side of the model. And now we're going to move over to the who. And the who side is very simple. It's me, we, community. And when I say community, it's about your customers, partners, vendors, and also your friends and family. But what we do in this is recognize that the me, we, community coexist, and we start with the me. Why? Because that's the most of what we can control, knowing that things will change around us, but we can actually focus on how we tether ourselves to what's important within us. So starting with the meme, the question is very simple in thinking about, are you okay? And the realization and acknowledgement and acceptance that it's okay not to be okay anymore. And to be able to acknowledge it within ourselves, let alone each other. We talked a lot about where we are from a psychological standpoint. And some people have been flourishing, some people have been languishing. The reality is that it's a spectrum. We, at any point of a day or a week or a month, can be along this, side of on one side of the spectrum or the other. The thing is it's okay. And the thing is, like, when we talk about showing up daily, people had this conception in the past of this being like 100% full every day, but the reality is that we show up as much as we can, and we'll have those days when we're languishing, we'll have these days when we're super engaged and flourishing and connected, and being real about it. Because when we talk about your whole being or your well-being or your happiness, it's not just about your work you or your life. It's this coexistence of both and your whole authentic you. So from a practical standpoint, we have an exercise, and again, I'll share this later in the QR code. It's called Wheel of Wholeness. And so instead of just talking to yourself or each other about, your skill set or how you're doing on your projects and all that, very important, but taking track and taking snapshots of where you are mentally, emotionally, relationally, physically, financially, spiritually, like all these components, pie pieces make us who we are. And being able to track this, let's say on a quarterly basis, so you can ask yourself, what is it that is going well in my wheel right now? Is it mental, physical, financial, whatever it is, make sure you celebrate it. And then look at it, where can it be strengthened? And set specific intentions to focus on what can be improved. Again, I can't see the chat, but if you want to share, where are you right now in your wheel? What are the things that are going well? Remember to celebrate it, and then what can be strengthened. And do this, we say on a quarterly basis. It's just so helpful to see how the wheel keeps on changing, but there's never a perfect place. But at least you know what you can, celebrate and what things that you need to focus and work on. So this is what leads to this greater greenhouse fund. And I think about it in a way like, we know what it means to invest and how to make money grow. But think about it in a way for your own self-care. Think about it in a way that's like your own well-being. Because sometimes people are like, yeah, I don't have time to do these things. But once we understand the value that it's giving us, as an example, like one person's meditation is so different from one person's massage. One person's walk in the park is so different from an ultra marathon runner. The point is, it doesn't matter what the specific thing, other than what it matters to you. And if you test different ways of how you can actually get value, recharging your battery and investing in your own personal greenhouse fund, every time you make this deposit, every time you keep testing the different things that will help you grow, will grow as you grow. And that essentially is the fund of you. As we invest in ourselves, you will realize the benefits. One thing to remember in all this, the biggest thing is to reflect and integrate what's working and what's not. It's not a one-hit wonder. Like once you run a marathon, it's not over. It's kind of like, okay, what else can I learn from this? What else can I practice from this? And then keep practicing. And sometimes you'll, waver. Maybe sometimes we can't meditate every day, but the whole point is a practice. And until we keep practicing and realizing the value of it, then we integrate it and then we actually embody it. One of the things that I realized in doing these things is that sometimes we feel like, it's a blur's day. When 2020 hit, every day felt the same. And I just feel like we're walking in a circle. But what we realize, if we do this testing and investing in our fund, we actually can look back. It's a spiral staircase. Sometimes it feels like we're running in circles, but really what we're doing is actually progressing bit by bit if we keep this whole idea of being able to practice in our fund and invest in it. So going from the me to the we, one of the most basic things that when people and CFOs and CEOs say, like, why does this matter to us? This chart speaks for itself. The best places to work, Glassdoor, best companies to work for, and Fortune, time over time, over the last 15 years, they outperform the S&P 500. So what this is saying is that those companies that double down on their people, actually financially rewarded. So what we can turn and reframe is that let's treat people as assets, not expenses. And once we start looking at that, then we can actually see how we can grow individually and our teams and organizations. We were talking about, as referenced before, in D&I and diversity and inclusion. A big thing about that is a sense of belonging and how we can actually grow together as a we team. So it's possible to feel lonely when there's tons of people around us, and how can we actually think about to be more supportive with each other? As an example, what I love to do when I talk about happiness, I define what happiness means. When we talk about DEI, DNI, DEIB, we need to define what it means. So as an example, who can empathize with this guy in the middle? You have your bear onesie in your closet and you accidentally wore it to your party, to a party without knowing. I just want to keep things simple and being able to say, look, this is what we mean by DEIB. Diversity is being asked to the dance. Inclusion is being asked to dance. Equity is having a turn to pick the DJ, play your own music, and belonging is being able to dance however you want. That is where true authenticity and the core of it, therefore happiness, can come in. Then when you have this creation of like environment where people feel like they belong, then you can actually have a plethora of ideas of how things can be adapted and changed based on the people that are involved. One of the sayings that I love in D&I discussions, like nothing about me without me. And so one of the things that's going on right now is like, people are trying to figure out how to adapt to all these changes in workplaces. And the reality is no one has figured it out yet. But what we can do is create a sense of belonging, get ideas, and start testing them. If anyone thinks they haven't figured it out, they need a reality check and reality pill. Because this is where we can actually start figuring out solutions, testing it, see what works, see what doesn't work, and making that like a virtuous cycle, and how we can actually create positive change in our workplace and in ourselves. So we went from me, we, community. Community greenhouse, it's pretty simple on how to think about it. I know it can be really complex. Again, this is about your customers, partners, and vendors. People are always like going to the table these days, especially asking, what's in this for me? But when we think about a community greenhouse, if we can expand and actually ask both questions and answer them at the same time, what's in it for me and what's in it for all, then you have implicit response and implicit solutions and things you can test. That is actually thinking about, yeah, individually, we want this for us as human beings and individual, but we also know this is going to impact in positive ways for the greater good. And this is kind of what leads up to the double ROI. It's a new metric that I've been thinking about and seeing happen when people put this in place with the greenhouse model that I've been talking about. The sense of ROI has been, as I shared earlier with the chart, there is a definite positive ROI when you actually look at people as an asset, not expenses. But the other ROI that's so important now, and a reason why people are disengaged or feeling burnout, is that when you have a sense of purpose and you're living by your values and you're defining things in a way that are most meaningful, you also have a ripple of impact. And what that means is like the companies that I share, like Airbnb, Patagonia, and I'm sure a lot of examples of where you work at IBM, is like when people individually are authentically themselves, living their higher purpose, living their values, doing things beyond making money, you're also developing and rippling in impact. Each individual and therefore the team and then therefore the whole organization is impacting the world in a greater way that is beyond themselves. One example that I love, and it's been a few years since this started, but I think it's just a stark example and a reminder of where we were in 2020. And it's one of our clients in New York. It's actually a hospital system called Northwell Health. And why I still love talking about them is because we, had it tough. We had a lot of challenges in our own workplaces, but imagine what they had to go through. All the hospital systems in the world, there was no data. We had really no idea what the virus was about. And essentially, it became kind of a war zone. There was no sense of, control, autonomy, and it was just a bunch of fear and uncertainty. Literally, people had to make life and death decisions every day based on a lack of data, and not just for their patients or their coworkers, but their own family members. So just imagining where like that kind of psychological lack of safety. But what was amazing is that this hospital somehow, hospital system, and I think it's around 80,000 employees at that time, they somehow rose from number 93 to number 19 best place to work during a pandemic. During a pandemic. And this is across any industry, not just hospital systems. So when I talked to the exec team, I said, hey, how did you guys do this? They said, hey, well, remember back in the day, we started culture transformation. We decided to focus on patients, and therefore we decided to focus on our employees. And then they literally walked the talk. The CEO originally was saying, they were telling him, don't leave this office because we have no idea what the virus is going to do. And he's like, no, I'm going to join my team. We're going to do this together. And so they built tents outside so that they had enough food and enough water. They had therapists and coaches to talk to them, to the employees, and they celebrated the wins along the way. So I bring this up because when I talked to them, like how they were able to get to this place of being a great place to work, it was very clear. It was by prioritizing people and their culture with purpose and values. And that, in that sense, they were able to focus from the me and ripple to the we, and of course their community. So just to wrap this all up, thinking about beyond happiness, what would happen if potentially you think in not just their typical highs, but really live fully in your highs and your lows? And thinking about what the greenhouse model is and what might help in pulling out, meeting where you're at of your purpose, of your values, behaviors, and how you can actually impact your own sense of purpose, and then for your teams and your community and family as well. So the question goes back to this, where I started. What's the world you want to live in? And how do you want to define it? A lot of people that I've been talking to, there's some consistent themes. I want to, be my best self. I want to grow. I want to be true to myself. I want to have a sense that my core values are aligned with the people I work with and in the society I live. I want to live with less worry and more meaning. Whatever you define it, that's yours to keep, and that's how you can align your own sense of happiness in a sustainable way. I know this is kind of heady sometimes because we have umpteen things that we need to do in the course of the day. But just remember, this is a quote inspired by Rumi. You're not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop. So with that, I want to wrap this all up in saying, if we can live high in our highs and lows fully in fulfilling ways, it gives us a sense of freedom from our internal state, from our own mental state, for our own inhibitions, and it also gives us a sense that we're living truly to our legacy now, not before it's too late. And with that, here's the QR code for the exercises that I mentioned. And so there's the happiness heartbeats exercise. There's also a purpose exercise in there. There's living legacy exercise, and there's also the wheel of wholeness. This has been amazing to do it for yourself, do it with your teams, and you can have deeply more intensive and meaningful conversations from the get-go. And with that, the code that I want to share, just to summarize everything, just please remember to embrace the highs and lows of life. Be real to your whole self with psychological safety in yourself. Invest and keep on testing what your mini greenhouse fund can be. And then just ripple your impact of who you are and your higher purpose from there. So thank you so much for your time. And I know I shared a lot of things, but if you remember anything from this presentation, just please remember to nurture your greenhouse. And I know that when we do that, we can grow better together. Thank you, everyone, for your time. And I think we might be going, I'm looking at my phone here. And I'll just stop sharing now.
All right. Jen, first of all, a very, very big thank you. A topic like happiness, and we've had many immersive sessions. I wish it was something that you can watch a seminar or read a book and you would get it like that. Unfortunately, that is not how real life works. It is experiential. It is something that you have to work on, and most of the time over long periods of time to do it, right? I mean, in my head it's 66 days, but as I learned from today's session, and I took copious notes. But in addition to that, one of the things that I have as an action for myself, of course, with one verse where I ended with, and I love the fact that we don't let our phones die. We have an extra battery pack. We have multiple USB cables, one in the car, one for the bag, one for blah, blah, blah. But I agree. I don't think we look after ourselves or our own greenhouses with that much of fail-safing or commitment as much as we have to our phones. And of course, if you like, I'm putting this across in my own words, charity begins at home. So it starts with you, and it grows bigger to the we, and then you can extend to the community. So lots of lessons, lots of reflections. Jen, thank you so very much. And a big thank you to your team that has been working alongside and bringing this together. So thank you. And I do want to thank our Women in the Corner Office team. Some of you are present here in the studio. There's at least a dozen more who is virtual and in different parts of the world. But for those who are here, can I just call you here for a quick second? If you can just run up here. All right, you're going to have to make it quick because you're flashing me the time cards. The time is running out. It's thank you. Thank you all so very much. Thank you. And Amit and everyone else who attended, thank you so very much for helping bring this together.
We are going to have a short break. We'll queue up a few videos. We're going to have a short break. And then we're going to come back for another session with Jen, which is going to be in 10 minutes, Jen. All right, can we queue up the videos, please?
So we've got Women in the Corner Office. This is a brand new series. We will have these every month or every alternate month. We're going to do a poll at the end.
When I think about allyship, what comes to mind is all around relationship. That's the word that truly resonates for me.
You've got to have a story that builds on itself. You repeat that story. The narrative has to stick because the brand does not get built overnight.
And the second thing I think is that when things are tough, you've got to roll up your sleeves and get down into the trenches, get into the details of the task at hand and find a solution.
And I hope we all do is what I would call interrupting bias, right? We all hope to eliminate it, but I think the start of that process is by interrupting it. When we see it, when we hear it, when we feel it, being an upstander, right?
But I also, as I alluded earlier, one of the very solid threads that has been common across my life and the relationship that I have with money is of responsibility. Because as I said, I took that upon myself to try and fix everything.
Programs such as WITCO truly set IBM apart. If you look around you and get involved, you'll find that IBM actually thrives in the amount of business resource groups that allow us to network.
That was our team, and those were our chapters. Very, very proud to be a part of this team. These were 2 campaigns that we ran, and we got this heartening response. And those are some of the themes that have come out that bring happiness to people. And then we started what we call as a happiness chain. And we're going to show you another video that is going to talk about the happiness chain that we created across the globe. And thank you very much. Like I said, stand by. We take a 10-minute break after the video and then come back for another session with Jen. All right? Thank you.
All right, people, thank you so much. I just want to take a last second. Thank you, everybody on the Watson Media. Thank you, everybody on YouTube. This is the first time we've gone on YouTube, and we've got a wonderful response. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And thank you, the team behind the stage. Take care.
Come back in 10 minutes.
We've got snacks in the pantry area. Please help yourself. And we'll be back in exactly 10 minutes. All right? Thank you.